Chapter 11. Grace had looked over her shoulder for more than a week. Ever since she'd told Andrew the almost truth about herself and Lily, she'd worried. She was using a false name, just like Lily was, but Andrew knew about her connection to Cassidy, which could lead him to Washington and her past. He was smart. He had resources. He could find out the truth about them if he wanted to. Or he could simply call the police and let them handle it. Why would he believe anything Grace said? But Lily was thriving, and Grace felt settled for the first time in a long time. She told herself she was safe there, and most of the time she even believed it. It was Tuesday night, and Lily was coloring a map of the U.S. She'd just filled in the state of Texas, baby blue, her favorite color, when she said, "I used to live in Texas." Grace dried her hands of dishwater and joined her at the kitchen table. "You did? When?" She shrugged. "I was a baby." Lily hadn't talked much about her life before Washington. "What do you remember about it?" Setting down the crayon, Lily looked up, her little face scrunched as she searched her memories. "I remember Nana. She was all soft and squishy and had white hair and smelled like fried chicken and peaches. I bet she was a good cook." Lily nodded and picked up her crayon again. But Grace wanted to know more. Maybe there was family out there who could take care of Lily, who could fight for her in court. Maybe Grace could give Lily to them. Not that she wanted to get rid of her. In fact, the longer she kept Lily, the more attached she became, which wasn't good. Lily wasn't hers, could never truly be hers. The more time she spent with her, the more heart-wrenching it would be when she had to give her up. "Do you remember where in Texas?" Lily shook her head. "It was hot, and there were cows and horses we used to drive by. I liked it there, but Mama hated it." Lily'd never mentioned her mother. In all the time Grace had spent with her, even when Grace had asked, the child had been close-lipped about the woman who'd birthed her. "Gently," Grace asked, "where is your mother?" She lifted her tiny shoulders and let them drop. "Daddy said she didn't want me anymore. I was too much trouble." Grace settled her hand over the child's wrist, careful not to touch her palm, and waited until Lily looked up. "I don't know what happened with your mom, but I can promise you that, if she left you, it wasn't because of anything you did. You are a sweet, kind, and amazing child, and wherever your mother is, she loves you very much. And if she doesn't, then there's something wrong with her, not you, because you, beautiful girl, are incredibly lovable." Lily blinked a couple of times, then returned to her coloring. Grace prayed the words would take root and grow in that tender heart. What kind of father would tell a precious child such a thing? A beast. After Grace got Lily tucked into bed, she returned to her laptop, trying fruitlessly to figure out what Myron Bowman was up to. She'd searched for his name 1,000 times since she'd left Washington, but never found anything except links to his photography website and glowing reviews about his work. Those hadn't been updated, though. Except on his own website, there were no new photos. No new reviews since before Lily was born. Grace had figured how to do an image search and loaded a photograph of Lily, but she'd found no photos of the girl except the ones she'd seen on Myron's website. If Myron had taken illicit photos of Lily, he hadn't posted them, at least not anywhere Grace could find. There was only one photo of Myron, taken when he was a younger man. According to the information in the Who's Who article, Myron had been a well-respected children's photographer whose pictures had appeared in magazines all over the world. He'd taken photos of the children of famous people, politicians and tech moguls, and movie stars. He'd been sought after. But that article had been written 9 years before. There was no new information about him at all. If he was so good at what he did, if he was so well known, what had he been doing holed up in a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere? She knew the answer to that. Apparently, being famous hadn't been his goal. He was working on getting filthy rich, emphasis on filthy. Or maybe his motivations were even darker. Maybe he hadn't gotten into the pornography game because he wanted to make money. Maybe he'd done it to feed his evil desires. She shuddered and slammed her laptop closed. If she were smart, she'd confine these searches to the hours when Lily was at school and focus on transcribing doctor's notes before bed. Something to calm her nerves rather than set them on edge. It was pouring outside, and she sat back and listened, allowing the familiar sound to calm her. She never thought she'd miss the rainy weather of Western Washington, but there was something soothing about being cocooned in a dry house while the weather raged outside. She breathed slowly in and out. She was safe. They were safe. Pulling back the curtain that covered the rear doors, she peeked outside. Lightning flashed in the distance, allowing her to see the expanse that separated her building from the one behind. The trees dotting the space bent in the wind. A few lights remained on at that late hour, but it seemed most folks had gone to bed. She needed to do the same. She dropped the curtain, shut off the lights, and made her way upstairs. She'd just brushed her teeth when a loud crash split the quiet. Then the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The lights went out. Her stomach dropped to the floor. Myron. It had to be Myron, using the storm as cover. He'd cut her lights. He'd broken her window. He was here. Panic crawled up her throat, tried to escape on a scream. She slapped her hand over her mouth. Think. She stood frozen in the upstairs hallway. She had to fight. If Myron was there, she had no other choice. She dashed into the bedroom and yanked her handgun from the hidden pocket in her purse and checked the chamber. She'd kill Myron before she let him take Lily back. If that meant prison, so be it. She slipped into the hallway, gun lifted and ready, listening. But the rain and wind and rumbling thunder were too loud. Myron could be walking up the stairs, and she wouldn't hear him. She aimed toward the staircase and inched that direction. She would kill him if she had to, but she'd rather simply grab Lily and escape. Was it too late for that? Was he inside? Why else break the window? Of course he was. She fought a wave of hysteria and inched down the stairs, pausing at the landing to peer around the corner. It was so dark, as she looked for moving shadows in the pale light coming through the blinds. The staircase was empty. Where was he? Everything inside her trembled, but she slowly took a step down. Cold air and the scent of rain swirled around her. The steady sound of the downpour accompanied the whistling wind and the rustling of branches. A window had been broken. No doubt about it. He was in her house. Jesus, please, please protect Lily and me. She took another step down. The sound of banging froze her in place. Banging? On the door? Grace, Grace, are you okay? Open up. Andrew, what in the... I'm coming in. The words were shouted a moment before the door opened. Andrew stepped inside, his key swinging from the lock, and moved a flashlight around the space. He must have caught sight of her because he lifted his hands, the beam of his light bouncing off the ceiling. It's just me. Just Andrew. She couldn't lower the gun, though. Myron was there. Andrew was going to get hurt, killed. Be careful! Her voice was high. He's here. He's going to... It was a tree, Andrew said. A tree fell. Didn't you hear it? Had she? She'd heard a crash. She'd heard a crack. Then a crash. He's not here, Grace. Andrew's voice was low and soothing, so different from her own. Please, lower the gun. His words penetrated. A tree had fallen. A tree had broken the glass. Not Myron. She was safe. Please? Andrew said again. She did as he asked, then sagged against the railing. She managed to sit before she fell. With trembling fingers, she engaged the handgun's safety. Before she could set it down, Andrew was beside her. Here, let me. She handed it to him, and he walked away, flashlight glowing on the hardwood. He returned a moment later. I put the gun in the cabinet where you keep your plates. You'll want to stow it before Lily sees it. At her nod, he continued, It's the kitchen window. Come on. He held out his hand to help her up. The last thing, the very last thing she needed at that moment was to touch his hand. She took hold of the railing and pulled herself to her feet, not even glancing to see his reaction. Sorry, it's just... Not that she could explain. I'm feeling a little off. It's okay. She heard no censure in his tone. He wrapped his arm around her waist, then asked, "Is it all right if I—" "Yes, thank you." She wished she didn't need the support, but she wasn't sure she'd stay standing without it. She made it down the stairs and into a chair. Her stomach was roiling. "Just lay your head down and breathe." Good advice. She dropped her forehead onto her arms on the table and inhaled and exhaled and told herself she was safe. They were safe. Where's Lily? Surely she's not still sleeping. It's her superpower, Grace said. She can sleep through anything. Lucky girl. Andrew was moving around. She heard crunching, sweeping, the opening of the drapes, then a cabinet and another. "Where's your trash?" he asked. "In the pantry." The door opened, followed by the sound of glass clattering into the empty can. "I'm going to get a tarp. Yours wasn't the only place hit. Thank God the tree landed on the ground, and not on somebody's roof." Grace looked up to see Andrew in the dim light coming through the back window. There were people out there. She could hear voices, see the bouncing of lanterns or flashlight beams. Andrew was watching her from the kitchen. "Are you okay?" "I think so. Thanks for not shooting me. Thanks for not being him. I do my best," she added, "and for being here, and for—" She waved past him at the mess in her kitchen. The window over the sink had shattered, and a leaf-covered limb fluttered in the opening. "Sorry I came in like I did," Andrew said. "I couldn't see from outside if your upstairs window had been hit. I was afraid you were hurt." Some kind of motor started up outside. "Hear that?" he asked. "It's a four-wheeler. Probably one of the maintenance guys, already working on getting this cleaned up. I ought to go help." "Okay." She pushed herself to standing. "Let me just grab—" "You stay. There are plenty of people around who aren't looking after a child. Men from the community, and maybe even some of the teenage boys. We'll get it taken care of. We'll just chop off that limb and get the window covered. Hopefully the lights will come back on soon. Meanwhile, you should be warm enough upstairs." "You don't have to—" But what was she going to do? She didn't know how to use a chainsaw. She didn't have a tarp. She didn't even own a ladder. Andrew's smile was gentle. "We've got it, Grace. It's okay to let people help sometimes." He started for the back door, then turned and held out his flashlight. "You need this?" "I have a couple, if anybody else needs one." "Good to know." Andrew slipped out the back door.
Chapter 12. It took a couple of hours of hard, wet labor, but finally Andrew and other neighbors had the tree cut and dragged away from the condos, the broken windows and damaged siding covered with plastic sheeting. The power company had been doing its part, and after the electricity came back on, Grace had opened her rear door and offered cups of coffee and snacks to anybody who wanted them. Thank heavens the storm had tapered to a light drizzle. By the time he was done, Andrew wanted nothing more than to crawl between his sheets and sleep. Instead, he climbed to Grace's patio and knocked on her glass door. "It's just me," he called. "We're all finished." She opened it and ushered him in, mug steaming in her hand. "So nobody needs this, I guess." They're all headed home. She set the coffee on the peninsula between the kitchen and dining area. "Pretty impressive how everybody came together to help. That's what people do in a community. Surely you've experienced that before." She shrugged. "Not with strangers." They weren't strangers. They were neighbors. Grace added, "I appreciate you and everybody who helped." They appreciated the coffee. He was dripping on the hardwood floor but didn't leave. "Look, are you planning to stay?" "No place else to go, and Lily slept through it all. I don't want to wake her." "But what about— I know you were nervous about her father." Grace's expression slid into what seemed an embarrassed smile. "Yeah, sorry about that. I panicked." "I don't think so. I think you reacted very rationally." In that moment when he'd seen her handgun, and then the fear in her eyes, he'd thought he was a goner. But as terrified as she'd been, she hadn't pulled the trigger. She'd been thinking, responding, fully aware of her surroundings. "I was especially impressed when you didn't shoot me." "Thank God I didn't. Who'd have covered my window?" He chuckled, the sound out of place in the quiet. "I'll get the glass replaced tomorrow, but in the meantime, do you really feel safe here?" Her lips pressed together and her gaze flicked to the plastic between her and the outside. We'll be fine. I have two options if you don't want to go to a hotel. One, you two can come stay at my place. I have an extra bedroom with a queen-size bed, which you'd have to share. She was already shaking her head. Okay then, option two, I sleep on your sofa. Still, the head shaking. It's fine. We'll be fine. Considering the way you greeted me a little while ago, I know you don't believe that. She lowered her voice. He isn't here. You want to believe that, but you don't really believe it. If you did, like I said, I panicked. I want you to be safe. For someone who'd practically collapsed in a puddle of relief earlier, she was being awfully stubborn. I think we are. Ignoring that, he said, also, I want you to feel safe, but you won't. You'll lie awake all night worrying about that open window, right? Her shrug was slight. It wouldn't be the first night's sleep I've lost. Andrew was too tired to have this argument. Look, Grace, you don't want to stay at my place. I get it. That'd be weird and you'd have to wake Lily. So either I sleep right there, he pointed to her sofa, which didn't look nearly as comfortable as his own bed, or I camp out on your patio in the rain. You decide. No, that's not. I'm tired. Decide. You don't have any right. Fine, go to a hotel. Her shoulders sagged. I don't want to wake her, which left one choice. I'm going to run home and change into dry clothes. Mind if I walk through? She didn't answer, seemed to be trying to catch up with him. He tracked water across the floor, figuring if she didn't clean it while he was gone, he'd do it when he returned. He stepped out her door and started to close it. Before he could, he glanced back to find she'd followed and was standing just a few feet away, looking terrified. He closed his eyes, shot up a quick prayer. I just thought of a third option. I'll call Cassidy. Number. She's pregnant. She needs her rest. Fine. Not Cassidy. He didn't exactly want to wake his boss at that hour, though Jackie would certainly do it. I have another friend. No. Grace shook her head slowly. You're very stubborn, you know that. So I've been told. Don't call anybody. If you insist, you can stay. I don't have any extra blankets, so... On it. Be right back. He dashed across the parking lot before she could change her mind. Grace's sofa had been more comfortable than he'd anticipated, but he'd had nightmares about that gun aimed his way, which brought back way too many memories. Prison and prisoners in orange jumpsuits, living and working and sleeping with one eye open, never sure where the next attack would come from. Prayer and scripture had helped him dispense with those old fears, which had opened his mind to other dreams, those about the pajama-clad woman who'd stood on the stairs looking terrified and helpless. When Grace came down early the next morning, tiptoeing past him, he'd peeked. Shouldn't have, he knew that. But he wasn't perfect, and she was an enigma, a mystery he wanted to solve, confident and frightened, strong and vulnerable. She was still in her pajamas, her blonde hair mussed from sleep. In the low light of dawn, he'd watched her fill the carafe, start the coffee brewing, then pull 2 mugs from the dishwasher. 2, one for each of them. He'd mashed his eyes closed and told himself to get out of there, which he'd done the instant she'd gone back upstairs. Though they'd since talked a couple of times and exchanged texts about getting the window repaired, he hadn't been back to her place, except in his memories and his dreams, and sometimes in new nightmares with faceless men crawling through broken windows. He needed to stop thinking about Grace. Something hit him in the head, and he shook himself from the thoughts and turned to Braden, who'd apparently smacked him. He was standing behind him, giving him a curious look. Where'd you go there? Just thinking. Yeah, I saw the steam coming out your ears. Braden nudged him out of the way and reached into his refrigerator to pull out a couple of sodas. Did you need something? Andrew lifted the Coke he'd grabbed before he'd gotten sidetracked by his thoughts. He'd been going to Braden's house to watch sports every Monday night since he'd moved to Coventry. Worried about the open house? Braden asked. The company they both worked for was putting together an event for prospective employees in 2 weeks. Nope. Andrew popped open the can and headed back to the living room, where sounds of the football game and their friends' conversation carried. It's coming together. We've got 30 great prospects. The event planner's taking care of the details. Good. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. Braden settled in the upholstered chair. Thomas and Garrett sat on opposite ends of the sofa. Reed, Jackie's husband, reclined on the love seat, stretching his long legs out as if he owned the place. Andrew grabbed a couple of slices of bruschetta from the plate on the coffee table and settled behind the sofa on the kitchen chair he dragged in. Braden's wife, Carly, had classed up the weekly guys' nights. Used to be they'd have store-bought chips and dip, maybe a platter of cold cuts from James's restaurant. Tonight, Carly'd served bruschetta with whipped feta on toast points, along with some kind of warm pizza dip. Monday night had become his favorite of the week. The living room was too small for the crowd, but nobody complained. Andrew would offer to have the weekly event at his place, but his living room was even smaller, and he didn't live with a gourmet cook. James, Dylan, and Fitz sat in chairs like Andrew's. Fitz was the newest member of the group and the oldest. Apparently, a couple of years past, he'd married Dylan's wife's best friend, Tabby. They'd been living in Rhode Island until Fitz's little sister graduated from high school. That summer, they'd moved to Coventry, where Tabby'd grown up. Andrew was still trying to figure out everybody's stories and how they were all connected. Desi is perfect, of course, Braden was saying about his newborn. She could have an ear in the middle of her forehead, Reed said, and you'd think she was perfect. Now Ella, on the other hand, is amazing. Reed bragged about his daughter for a few minutes. Andrew couldn't remember how old she was. 6, maybe? 7? A little younger than Lily. He'd seen the two girls playing together at church the day before. Despite his invitation, Grace hadn't wanted to attend after their trip to the ER, but apparently Cassidy had strong-armed her, as he'd seen Grace sitting beside his friends. If he'd had a hard time concentrating on the sermon that day, he didn't think too hard about the reason. The football game was a blowout, and nobody was paying it much attention. Thomas turned to Andrew. Have you solved the mystery of your father's company yet? He polished off the bruschetta, sipped his soda, and settled it on his knee. I'm missing a few months of data. When I get that, your dad didn't give you everything? Reed swung his legs to the floor. Why not? Not sure he knew. He gave me what Chet gave him. Andrew had already filled them in on what he was doing for his father, something he'd never have done with other friends. But he trusted these guys. They all went to the same church. They'd shared their difficulties and struggles, which had given him the courage to do the same. What do you think about that? James asked. I can't decide if Chet's hiding something or if he's just an imbecile. From what you've told us, Dylan said, I'd guess the second. It's possible he's not as dumb as I've made him out to be, Andrew admitted. I don't exactly admire the guy, but that doesn't make him stupid. Fitz was nodding slowly. He looked a little too much like a Hollywood leading man, a little too pretty. Though Andrew figured that, when he donned his sidearm and his badge, he had no trouble being taken seriously. Andrew was glad he'd gotten to know Fitz before he'd discovered he was in law enforcement, or else he might be nervous around him. If he's been skimming, Fitz said, maybe he's too stupid to figure out how to hide it. Skimming. Andrew hadn't let himself go that far with his theories. James leaned forward and faced Andrew. That would be awkward, having to tell your father that your half-brother's stealing from him. Much as I dislike the guy, I don't want that to be the case. I'm trying to repair my relationship with Dad, not drive another wedge in it. But if you discover the truth, Thomas asked, won't that help your relationship? Before Andrew could say anything, Reed said, then his dad would have to admit he's been wrong about Cheddar Chet. Andrew smiled at the nickname the guys had all started using. Being proved wrong? Reed shook his head. That can be the death knell to any relationship. Especially one as tenuous as theirs, Braden added. Wow, you guys are a ray of sunshine tonight. Andrew infused the words with amusement, though he feared Reed and Braden were right. We'll be praying, Dylan said. Let me know if you need any help with anything. I'll be happy to lend a hand. Appreciate that, though he hoped he wouldn't need Dylan's skills as a former detective. Tell us about the blonde. Garrett turned to face Andrew, eyebrows waggling. What are you talking about? Oh, come on, man. Garrett's gaze traveled the room. You guys saw it, right? The drool? James asked. I'm pretty sure the pastor saw it from the pulpit. The guys laughed and Andrew joined in, though he wasn't amused. Grace is attractive, sure, I noticed. Reed shrugged. She's okay if you like blondes. I'm partial to redheads. Dylan rubbed a hand over his carrot-colored hair. Thanks, man, I never knew. Reed shot him a look. Not that. The pretty kind. "Oh, you say the nicest things." Dylan's remark earned a laugh from the guys. "I want to hear more about this blonde," Braden said. "We haven't been at church since Desi was born. What did we miss?" "She's a friend of Cassidy's," James said, "from Seattle. Originally, though, she had to have been living in New Hampshire for a while. Andrew wondered what had brought her there. He considered asking James about that, but the last thing he needed was to encourage this conversation. A neighbor, that's all." "Sure, sure," Garrett said. "That's all it seemed like when you spent hours repairing her window." "She's a tenant. That was my condo getting rained into." "Uh-huh." Garrett's words were filled with skepticism. "That doesn't explain you returning to her place with blankets and pillows." "Whoa!" James peered past Fitz, looking not at all amused. "What's that?" "We put her up there so you could keep an eye out, not take advantage of her." Irritation and frustration crawled up Andrew's throat, even as heat filled his neck. "I'd like to think you know me better than that by now." "I'd like to think so too," James said. Between them, Fitz backed his chair away. "I'm just going to get out of the line of fire here." Andrew ignored him. He had no idea what James and Cassidy knew about Grace's situation, and he certainly didn't feel comfortable discussing it. Maybe James knew more than Andrew did, maybe less. Either way, he knew enough to want Andrew to keep an eye on her. She was nervous about intruders. Andrew'd been nervous about intruders. "Her window was broken. I stayed on the couch." James studied him another moment, then nodded. "Yeah, okay." "The sorry for accusing you was apparently supposed to be implied." Garrett cleared his throat. "I figured it was something like that. What with the blankets and all. I mean, why would you bring your own blankets if you were planning to share her bed?" The guy was about as subtle as a sledgehammer. "And you," Andrew said, "do you have nothing better to do than spy on me?" "You're not that interesting, man." Garrett smirked. "I saw you when I came back from returning the chainsaw to the maintenance shed." "Anyway," Reed said into the awkwardness, "you like this woman?" "She's a neighbor." "Whom you find attractive," Braden added. "Considering that the single women at work haven't caught your eye, I'm eager to meet her." How did this conversation become about Andrew and his love life? Lack of love life? What are you talking about? You can't have not noticed Sarah and Allison? The way they giggle when you walk by? Allison's way too old for me. She's 32, and Sarah-Lynn's in her 20s and not exactly a strain on the eyes. And single, and definitely interested. Andrew hadn't noticed. Both women had been friendly, sure. But was there more to it than that? Allison wasn't his type at all. Sarah-Lynn was pretty and smart, but he felt no attraction to her, unlike his new neighbor. "Here's the deal." James's voice was dead serious. "You have a thing for Grace. That's fine, but you treat her with kid gloves. That woman's had a world of hurt in her life. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I know enough about her to know she doesn't need her heart broken." Who's breaking anybody's heart? How had the conversation gone so far afield? "She's my tenant, nothing more." But even as Andrew said the words, he knew he was lying, both to his friends and to himself, because he hadn't gone a waking hour without thinking about Grace since their trip to the ER, worrying about Lily's father showing up, wondering if Grace was thinking about running again, hoping she wouldn't. Hmm. James regarded him through squinted eyes as if he could read his thoughts. "Just remember what I said." Andrew wasn't concerned about James's unspoken threat. He wouldn't do anything to hurt Grace. But maybe rather than sitting around obsessing about her, he could do something about the danger she was in. Maybe he could help her prove what she believed about Lily's father. Then if the man showed up, they could get him put behind bars. Grace and Lily wouldn't have to spend their lives in fear. Grace could start looking forward. And maybe if she did that, she'd see Andrew. Really see him. He was surprised to find he wanted that.
Chapter 13. It had been a week since the storm. In that week, Grace had relaxed, allowing herself to hope, once again, that they were safe. But the more she thought about what had happened the night before, the more convinced she was that she and Lily had to run. Maybe the intruder on her back patio hadn't been Myron Bowman, but there'd definitely been somebody there. If not for Regis's barking, would he have broken in? Would Lily already have been taken? As little as Grace wanted to, she had to assume Myron had found them again. She spent the bulk of Tuesday morning obsessing over the problem, praying for guidance. Maybe the Lord was leading her one way or another. She had no idea. Fear had taken hold, and she couldn't keep it at bay. She considered relocating to another state, but Myron had found them everywhere they'd gone. It was time to leave the country. Maybe if they were in Canada or Mexico or France. Yes, France. She'd studied French in high school and college and spoke it passably. They'd find a place in the country, and she'd enroll Lily in the local school. The child was young. She'd pick up the language quickly. They could blend in. Maybe if they were in Europe, Myron would give up and leave them be. She didn't want to yank Lily away from her new friends and the home they'd built. She didn't want to leave the sanctuary they'd found in Coventry. But if Myron had found them, it was no longer a sanctuary. What choice did she have? Lily climbed into the SUV after school that afternoon, chattering at top speed. "It's Jilly's birthday party, and she invited the whole class." Lily waved the invitation. "It's on Friday night, and there's going to be a magician. Can I go, Miss Grace? Please?" Grace fought the tears that prickled her eyes. "Sounds like fun. We got to get her a present. I've never been to a birthday party in my whole life. Can I have a birthday party too, with a magician?" "We'll see." Not that they could celebrate her actual birthday, which Lily had told her was in January. They'd have to celebrate the one on her fake birth certificate, which was in March. Maybe by March, they'd be settled, and Lily would have a whole class full of friends she could invite to a party. Except they'd need to get new papers. If Myron had found them, then he could easily have discovered their new identities. Would the falsified passports she'd paid 6 months' salary for get them out of the country and into France? She prayed they were as good as the forger claimed. Grace managed to act normally throughout the afternoon. She gave Lily a snack and helped her with her homework. When Lily cried because Grace wouldn't let her go to the park to play with her friends, Grace allowed her to watch TV, something she rarely did. She was just starting dinner when a knock sounded on the front door. Grace's stomach lurched. Lily called, "I'll get it!" "No!" The harsh tone had Lily stopping, wide-eyed. "You know you're not allowed to answer the door without permission. We've discussed that." "Yes, ma'am." Lily fell back onto the sofa with a pout, and Grace peeked through the front window. Andrew stood on her stoop. When she pulled open the door, he said, "Sorry to stop by unannounced." Maybe company would make the hours go faster. Not that she was in a hurry to leave, but just to be done with it. To put to rest this town, and all the hope she'd made the mistake of feeling. "It's fine. I haven't had the chance to thank you in person for getting that window repaired so quickly." "My pleasure." Lily bounded off the couch and hugged his waist, then backed up and held out her cast. "Look at all the people who signed it." "Wow." He crouched down and looked for a long time. "You've got a lot of friends." "I know, and I'm going to a birthday party Friday night." She practically bounced with excitement. "That's super cool. You're going to have a blast." Lily returned to the couch and the TV show, and Grace said, "Come on in. I was just fixing dinner." "I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to talk to you about something." He settled at one of the bar stools, and she pulled a package of macaroni out of the pantry and started a pot of water to boil. She'd already browned the rest of the hamburger meat from her freezer and added it to the spaghetti sauce. "No intrusion. You're welcome to stay." "I don't want to eat your food." "It's not a problem. The least I can do after you rescued us." And it wasn't as if she could take it with her. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about?" He'd lowered his voice. "Well, not that exactly. But what you told me about." He tipped his head toward Lily in the other room. "What about it?" "I think your best defense is a good offense." "Meaning?" "I reached out to an old friend from school who works for a software developer. They've developed this advanced facial recognition software. I told him what we were looking for, and he said he could run the software on the dark web, see if her image popped up." Grace wasn't sure if she should be grateful or irritated that Andrew had asked without consulting her. He must have seen something in her expression because he said, "It's not like I gave him your name. And he lives in Boston. It's not somebody you've met." It's nice of you to try to help us. But even if we found her picture, what would be the point? As far as I can tell, Myron's living outside the law. You could prove what he's doing, get him arrested and thrown in jail. Exploiting minors is serious business. They'd have to find him first. Nobody can stay hidden forever, Grace. Didn't she know it? It was a good idea. If only they didn't have to run again. Maybe, if Andrew found the proof, and if he could get word to Grace, she and Lily could return to the States. Maybe even to this little corner of the world where Lily had found such acceptance. Grace had too. The neighbors who'd helped with her window, then all the kind folks she'd met at church. She'd forgotten how much she liked and needed to be in a community. The water started to boil, and she dumped in the macaroni and stirred. I just need to get a good photograph of Lily, Andrew said. She set the wooden spoon on a plate and leaned against the counter. We can't stay here. His eyebrows hiked. What are you talking about? What happened? Last night, we had an intruder on the back patio. If not for the dog barking. I don't know that it was him, but who else would have been snooping around our place? I can't take the chance. Andrew's chuckle had her blood pressure rising. It's not funny. Sorry, I know, it's just. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen. Then he handed it to her. It's that neighborhood app. I get the alerts. She read the headline. Bring in your pumpkins at night. The story talked about two teenage boys who'd been caught on multiple doorbell cameras in the past. They'd been caught on backdoor cameras the night before, apparently thinking they could wreak havoc without being caught if they stuck to the back patios instead of the front. If you scroll down, you'll see the parents admitting their kids snuck out last night. They're both grounded. She read the whole post and all the comments. Sure enough, the kids had been out at the time when Regis had been barking. She closed her eyes and breathed a prayer of relief. They didn't have to leave. They were safe in Coventry. She'd almost blown up their entire lives because of a couple of mischievous teenagers. How many times had she run based on a feeling, a bizarre experience, or the thought that she might have seen Myron in a crowd? How many times had she run based on nothing? When she opened her eyes again, Andrew was watching her. His expression was no longer amused. He held out his hand, and she gave him back his phone. If I hadn't stopped by, would you have told me? Huh? Grace turned to stir the macaroni in the sauce. Truth was, she hadn't planned to tell anybody she was leaving. Cassidy, though, right? Andrew asked. You wouldn't leave without letting her know where you were going. With no other excuse to keep her back to him, she turned and leaned against the counter. It's been a while since I've had anybody. She shook her head, started over. We've been on the run so long, just Lily and me, that honestly, it didn't even occur to me. His lips pressed together. A moment passed before he spoke. Can you imagine how that would have been for Cassidy and James? For me? To suddenly discover you gone? I don't know what they know, but I'd always wonder. He lowered his voice. If her father had found you, we wouldn't know if you were dead or. I'm sorry, you're right, of course. About Cassidy, anyway. It wouldn't have occurred to her that Andrew cared. He studied her another long moment, then shook his head slowly. After blowing out a deep breath, he smiled, though it seemed forced. What do you think about my idea? If we can prove what we believe, we can take the information to law enforcement, and they can keep their eyes out for. What's his name? Myron Bowman. If she could prove Myron was a child pornographer, then if the police caught up with Grace, she'd have the ammunition to take him down. Probably wouldn't save her from paying the penalty for her crime, but Lily would be safe. I'll agree to it, she said, if you promise not to do anything more without my permission. We need to handle this with care. Sure, of course. Whatever you think is best. He said that now. Would he be willing to hold off on what they learned, assuming they learned anything? Was it worth the risk? To get information that would keep Myron from ever regaining custody of his daughter? Yes, that was definitely worth the risk. Grace sent Andrew a photograph of Lily from her phone and called her in for dinner. Are you gonna stay? Lily asked Andrew. His phone made a swishing sound, that indicated a sent message, and his gaze flicked to Grace's. If it's really okay. Sure. She hadn't even set the table. While Andrew and Lily filled their plates, she set forks and napkins out, then added the loaf of bread and a stick of soft butter. Not exactly gourmet cooking, but then she hadn't planned on company. Lily kept up a steady stream of conversation, talking about everything from what she'd learned at school that day, to how much fun she'd had at Sunday school, to what she wanted to get her friend for her birthday. The party that, thanks to Andrew, she'd be able to attend. Thank God he'd come by. The man had rescued her from a life-altering decision. Amazing how much Lily had come out of her shell since they'd left Washington. This child who used to be so quiet talked incessantly, smiled constantly, giggled frequently, and, unlike the first few weeks after leaving her father, slept soundly. Whenever Grace wondered if she'd done the right thing that terrifying spring night, she thought about the changes in Lily and knew she had. Myron's exploitation had harmed his daughter in countless ways, ways Grace was only beginning to uncover. But praise God for the resiliency of children. What do you think, Miss Grace? She blinked, scrambling to figure out what Lily was talking about. Across the table, Andrew said, I think something craft-related sounds like a great idea. Yes. Grace shot him a grateful look. When I was your age, I used to love friendship bracelets. Do you think she'd like a kit to make those? What's a friendship bracelet? Grace explained the brightly colored woven bracelets she and her friends used to trade and wear with pride, remembering those easy days of childhood. She and her mother hadn't had much money, but they'd been happy. Her mom's second marriage had solved the money problem and destroyed everything else. Yes! Lily bounced in her seat. Can I be excused? Can I get on your computer and see if I can find one? I bet they have them online. Do we have time to order one? Should we go shopping? I love toy shopping. Andrew chuckled, shaking his head. Satisfied that Lily'd eaten all she was going to, Grace said, Bring me the laptop, please. Lily did, and Grace opened a browser for her, making sure to close all the tabs related to French cottages and overseas flights. She always used a private window to search for Myron, and that was closed. The history not saved. Lily should be safe to browse. Don't open any more windows, and don't answer any messages, Lily finished. I know. Lily took the laptop and sat on the couch, where she scrolled through the products Grace had pulled up on the shopping site. Andrew was still smiling. She uses more words in an hour than I use all day. She's thriving here. It's a good place, Andrew said. When I first moved here, I was a little like Lily. I hid it better, but I was nervous at my new job. After living in the city and other places that weren't exactly friendly, I worried about how I'd fit in. His shy smile was even more attractive than the confident one he usually wore, which was saying something. That surprises me, Grace said. You seem so self-assured. I am. Totally self-assured. He winked. Or at least, I pretend to be, which is practically the same thing. Practically? Speaking of returning favors, were we? She asked, hearing the amusement in her own tone. My father's birthday party is this weekend at his place in Hollis. She'd never heard of Hollis, but she couldn't say so. Andrew'd never asked about where she'd moved from, but considering he thought she was a foster parent, he had to assume it was another town in this state. About how far is that from here? It's an hour and a half or so, near Nashua. I know it's a long way to go for a party when you won't know a soul there, but... Again, the shy smile was back. I could sure use some moral support. You don't get along with your father? We've had issues. I'm working on it, which is why I'm going to this thing. Normally I wouldn't bother, but if I really want to repair our relationship... Of course Andrew should go. But did Grace want to? Church was one thing, but to meet a bunch of strangers, to make small talk, to shake hands? Before you say no, he said, you should know Lily would love it. They're going to have a bounce house. I have nephews who are about her age who never miss an opportunity. A bounce house? Lily popped up on the sofa. Can we go, Miss Grace? Can we, please? Andrew said. Oops. She laughed. Sure, you didn't do that on purpose at all. He just shrugged. Brat. Lily's expression was filled with hope. How could she say no to that? Andrew's next words were spoken quietly. I wasn't kidding about the other, though. I could use a friend. It wasn't as if she had plans. Oh, all right. Yippee! 2 parties in one weekend. Lily returned her attention to the laptop. Andrew stood and grabbed his plate. Sorry, not sorry. Yeah. Forgiven, not forgiven. He chuckled. You done? She scooted back from the table. I got it. You're the guest. You cooked. He took the plate from her hand and went into the kitchen, where he dumped the remains in the trash and started filling the dishwasher. Seriously, I can do it. I know you can. But he kept at it, so she mixed the leftover macaroni and sauce and put it in a plastic container. To be honest, she said, I'm looking forward to meeting your parents. Do you and your mom have a good relationship? Yeah, excellent. He filled the saucepot with water and added some soap. But Dad's not married to Mom, not since I was a kid. He traded her in for a younger model. Oh, sorry. To his credit, Andrew added, he stayed married to Christine for over 20 years. They have 3 kids. Do you have any full siblings? He shook his head. Do you? Full or half or step? No, none. My mom had a miscarriage after I was born. I think she'd have tried again. But my father was killed in Afghanistan in 2002. Oh. Andrew looked over his shoulder at her. That's awful. She shrugged. I remember him. Not well, but I remember how I felt when I was with him. He loved me. He was a good father, a good man. It must have been hard growing up without him. Did your mom remarry? When I was about Lily's age, they didn't have any kids. Not sure if he didn't want them, or she couldn't get pregnant again, or what. Oliver jumped onto the counter and approached the butter dish like a tiger stalking its prey. Don't even think about it. She shooed the cat away and covered the dish. You're a nuisance. You know that? I'm just trying to help, Andrew said. Not you, Goober. He continued working on the dishes. Been called worse. She shook her head. Lily, time to take Regis out. The child hurried in, the dog at her feet. You coming? We'll stay inside. Stay in the fenced-in area. Lily's sigh communicated her displeasure, but Grace couldn't let her wander off alone. Andrew shut the water off. These are done, if you want to go out with her. Did Andrew want to join them, or was he telling her he was ready to head home? She was surprised to find she hoped the first, not the second. Being in New Hampshire had been healthy, not only Lily. It seemed Grace had done a little bit of healing, too. Craving adult human interaction? It had been a long time since she'd done that. Okay then, she said. Grab a coat and a plastic bag, sweetie. Andrew stood beside her. I didn't wear one. She laughed. Silly, Lily said. She's talking to me. The child was still shoving her arms into the light jacket when she bounded outside, Regis on her heels. Grace followed. Behind her, Andrew said, Can Oliver come? I tried to make him an indoor cat, but he communicated his displeasure with that very soon after I got him. Andrew held the door open, and Oliver dashed outside and took off. The temperature was in the 50s, but would probably fall quickly now that it was dusk. The community's old-fashioned streetlights lit up as they walked. Lily led the way on their familiar route toward the park, Regis bolting this way and that, then returning to bark at her heels. As soon as the playground equipment was in sight, both child and dog took off to play. You're doing a really good job with her, Andrew said. How did you come to be her foster parent? That's kind of a long story. Suffice it to say, she and I have a connection. You do? That day after she fell? Andrew turned to her, his face barely discernible in the dim light. I wasn't very kind to you. I'm sorry about that. I should have been paying better attention. I was trying to find information about Myron. Any luck? She shook her head. I just wish I knew where he was. if he was on our tail, or I always feel like if I turn around really fast, he's going to be right there. Must be scary living like that. I'd like to say I'm getting used to it. I hope you don't. His words were serious when he added, I hope the man's caught long before being afraid becomes second nature. They watched Lily and Regis play for a few minutes before Grace called the child back. Bath time and bedtime. Before Lily could argue, she added, You have not one but 2 birthday parties this weekend. I think you're one blessed kid, so let's not complain, all right? Grace started back toward their condo, and Lily followed without a word. Andrew brushed his fingers against Grace's wrist, her only warning that he was about to hold her hand. She snatched it back and crossed her arms. He turned her direction, hurt and embarrassment clear in the light from the nearby street lamp. Sorry. She was trying to come up with some words to excuse her poor behavior when Lily piped in. Miss Grace doesn't like to hold hands. The child said the words as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It makes her feel funny. She looked up at Grace. Right? Now Grace was the one feeling embarrassed. You're very insightful, sweetheart. It does make me feel funny. How come? Lily asked. It's sort of hard to explain. Okay. Seemingly satisfied, Lily chased Regis, who'd caught sight of Oliver and had rushed ahead to investigate. Would it be hard to explain to me? Andrew's voice was low and deep, the question almost tentative. Yes, but maybe I will someday. They walked a few feet in silence, and then his hand touched the small of her back. That okay? The gentle pressure felt warm through her sweatshirt, comforting, oddly intimate. Maybe she should tell him no. Maybe she should step away, stop this friendship from deepening into something more. But she didn't want to. Grace was 25 years old, and she'd never been in love. She'd never had a boyfriend. She'd never even dated. It wasn't that she was against the idea. It wasn't that men hadn't been interested in her. But she'd never been the slightest bit attracted to anyone. In fact, more than once, she'd wondered if there were something wrong with her. You're perfectly normal, Mama Lucy had told her. It'll happen when it happens. Was it happening now? With Andrew? Or was Grace just grateful for the man's kindness? She'd felt grateful before. She'd never felt this. The hand dropped from her back. I didn't mean to. It's fine. I mean, it was fine. The hand, on my back. She sounded like an idiot. Andrew returned his hand, then slid it around to rest on her side, just above her hip. How about that? Is that okay? She nodded, enjoying the feeling. He sidled closer until she was tucked against his side. How about that? How far are you going to go with this? Almost sounds like a challenge, and I love a good challenge. She laughed. Let's stop here for now. Okay, for now. Maybe we'll practice some hand-holding on our date this weekend. She froze, but he nudged her along. Don't get cold feet on me now. You already said yes.
Chapter 14. Myron growled beneath his binoculars as the neighbor wrapped his arm around Grace. That man had no business touching her. He had no business being anywhere near Lily. There was still much work to be done. In the meantime, Grace had better not let the neighbor get too close or too familiar. Myron would have to step up his timetable, complete the space he was designing, especially for his girls. Then he'd reclaim them both. And if the neighbor came anywhere near, he wouldn't know what hit him.